Continuing on with Plato's Republic, in Book 3, Plato continues his preliminary account of the education of the guardians. And at first we don't know it's a merely preliminary account because he hasn't yet introduced the need for a more in-depth philosophical education, as he will later, but we can anticipate that and at the same time take this account for what it is, which is Plato's adaptation of what was essentially a conventional Greek education, the education of the guardians in music and in physical training. So if we look through this account, we see, first of all, the music here, the musicae, the arts of the muses. That's going to involve poetry and then music in the narrower sense. And Plato goes through and talks about both the content and the style of poetry that will be acceptable in the perfect city, as well as the harmonies and the rhythms that will be acceptable music. And I think the importance that he places on especially the stylistics and harmonics and the rhythmics of musicae is a little bit unusual for us, and we need to think a bit about what the Greek presuppositions were about the way in which the soul was rightly ordered in order to appreciate why Plato spent so much time on this and why the Greeks did. It's not, I think, totally foreign to our present way of thinking, but it's a little bit foreign. And then the second part is the sound body into which the sound mind has to go. His discussion of physical training, which also includes a little excursus on the legal system and medical treatment, which he sees as parallel to each other in many ways. And so this is the bulk of Book 2 of the Republic, dealing with the preliminary account of the education of the guardians. And then after this, he introduces the question, who should rule? Who among these guardians should rule? And how should we select them? So it's the selecting process that's going to lead to the sifting process, if you will. That's going to lead us to the most perfect guardians who are best suited to rule. And that is then going to launch us onto the next phase of our discussion of how the guardians are to be educated. So first of all, we have the discussion of the education of the guardians in poetry, in the stories that they are to memorize, to, as it were, incorporate into their very being. And we've already seen last time that Plato is very critical of the way in which the poems of Homer and Hesiod, in his mind, distort the true nature of the gods. But it's not just in their portrayal of the gods, but also in other mythological elements that Plato sees there being a real problem in the traditional accounts. So one aspect that he's critical of is the portrayals of Hades that you find in traditional Greek poetry and mythology. It's a given that it's very crucial that the guardians be fearless. This is, after all, the warrior class. They have to go into battle. They have to risk death. And so they shouldn't fear death. Hence, we shouldn't allow poets into our perfect city who are going to paint fearful pictures of Hades in the imagination. So there's a fair amount of discussion on this. I take it that you can appreciate this for yourself. I don't need to go into much detail about that. Pretty straightforward. The afterlife shouldn't be portrayed as something to be feared, because then, of course, the guardians will run away from battle, and because they don't want to wind up in this fearful afterlife that they've grown up fearing. So they shouldn't be made to fear that. Also, on a more positive note, we shouldn't allow portrayals of famous men behaving in shameful ways. Essentially, in any way other than what became known as a Stoic way of behaving for Plato is unacceptable. Of course, this is anachronistic, since Stoicism didn't come along until quite a bit later after Plato, but partly under the influence of Plato. So famous men who are portrayed as lamenting in some loud way, or engaging in unbridled laughter, or lying. Only the rulers can lie, as we'll see. He makes that qualification right away, though. that will allow our rulers to lie, but everyone else should be taught to regard lying as something shameful and to be avoided essentially at all costs. So we should portray people like Odysseus, for example, engaging in deceit of any kind, insofar as he's held out as being someone who is to be admired and emulated as a hero. No out-of-control sexual appetites. Our guardians should be temperate in all things, and they shouldn't engage in sex in any way that suggests a lack of self-control, lack of temperance. No taking of bribes. Of course, in our rulers and our leaders, our police force in the city, the last thing we want is people who are susceptible to bribes. So there's of course a background assumption that's worth thinking about, and perhaps even discussing, that Plato is working with here, which is that the mores of the guardians, of the children of this class, are going to be assimilated essentially through these stories. They're going to learn right and wrong from these stories. And so if you tell them stories that hold it up as something to be emulated, that they should behave in ways that are considered by Plato to be shameful, you're going to end up with guardians who are prone to shameful behavior. It'll be your own fault because you didn't properly censor the poets. These poets have told false stories. They've represented the gods as doing harmful things. We already know that, and that's emphasized again in Book 3. So we should be ruthless in our willingness to slash these poets' texts and excise everything that suggests bad morals so that we can protect the young guardians as they're growing up from these influences. Socrates implies that the only stories that will be allowed to be told in the city will be stories about the consequences of just and unjust living, kind of moralistic tales, sort of like Aesop's fables, things like that. And this, though, is going to create a potential problem, which is that we first have to be able to know these consequences. What are the consequences of just and unjust living? What is justice itself? What is virtue itself? And so it's premature to discuss that, he says, at this point in the dialogue. We can't discuss these things until we're clear on exactly what justice and injustice are, and then we'll be able to craft stories that will lead the young to appreciate the true nature of justice. So there's a bit of a tension here because obviously Socrates has to be relying upon some, at least implicit or tacit understanding of the wrongness of many of the things that are portrayed in Homer and Hesiod primarily. But at the same time, he's suggesting, well, we don't really know what justice is. We don't really know positively how to portray it. And so I think there is a potential tension there. It seems like it's easier to be a critic and to recognize things as being unjust or as being harmful for kids to learn than it is to be able to positively say how we should portray the good life or how we should portray how they should learn. And in a sense, of course, that's the whole purpose of this work, is to lay out the idea of the just life, which is, in Plato's sense, the completely good life, the life that's completely representative of a healthy soul and therefore is good living. Okay, so this leads to the first discussion question, which also encompasses the end of the previous book. So first discussion question. Keeping in mind the rules for the portrayal of the gods at the end of Book 2 and here at the beginning of Book 3, would you agree that such censorship is justified for the sake of the good of the city? Is it necessary for the proper education of children that they be given a religious education of this general sort, even if not necessarily of these specific gods or stories? Is such an education a religious cum moral education, or religio-moral education? Is an education like this needed in order to form good citizens? Why or why not? Why not just teach them, straight science or something like that? Why is it necessary, so important for them to have this kind of poetic education that teaches a certain moral content to them? That would be the gist of the question. So again, first discussion question, keeping in mind the rules for the portrayal of the gods at the end of book 2 and here at the beginning of book 3, would you agree that such censorship is justified for the sake of the good of the city? Is it necessary for the proper education of children that they be given a religious education of this general sort, if not necessarily of these specific gods or stories? So here I'm asking, if you're a Christian or Muslim, or do you believe that it would be necessary in the perfect Christian society, the perfect Muslim society, perfect Jewish society, what have you, perfect Buddhist society, that the children be educated in this sort of religious storytelling way that tells a moral, this kind of moralistic education with the religion-tinged content, regardless of course, whether you accept Greco-Roman religion or whatever as the appropriate religious content to be imparted. Do you believe that kind of education is necessary? That's what I'm asking. Is such an education needed to form good citizens? Do we need to have people who share some kind of religious vision, whether it's Judeo-Christian or Greco-Roman, in order to have good citizens? Why or why not? Okay. So this brings us beginning around 392D, which is page 276 in our text. The discussion of style. So we've been talking about the content, but the style is just as important for Plato and I would say for the Greeks generally. And we have 3 kinds of styles of poetry here. There's the style that involves narration with imitation, the style that involves narration alone without imitation, and then a mixed style. Which would be the typical. So the narration, I shouldn't say with, I should say via. We'll say narration through imitation. That's a little bit clearer from what I mean to prevent confusion with the idea of the mixed style. So here's what we typically have in what we think of as plays, where for the most part you don't have a separate narrator. You just have the narration, the narrative element of the play occurring through the dialogue of the various characters, which may involve, they may tell a story at some point in time. To move the plot along, you may have a particular character have to tell a story, but they're telling the story in that particular character's persona, through that particular character's voice. And therefore we, of course, as an audience, we tend to assume that that narration is going to be biased in the particular ways that character is biased. It's going to be told through the lens, through the eyes of that particular character, as opposed to the typical assumption when you're dealing just with an anonymous narrator, that this person is a kind of omniscient voice of God who's just sort of telling you just the way it is from some kind of absolute vantage point. So that's the contrast between narration by imitation and then just a narrative alone. And then you have a mixed style, which you have in Homer, for example, where occasionally there'll be narration that is through imitation and then a narration that is just from this absolute standpoint. So the question is, should our guardians be imitators or not? And if so, of what? So Plato seems to be assuming a kind of education here that's going to involve them learning, perhaps by heart, this poetry, and therefore of having to imitate, become actors, essentially, having to imitate the various characters in these poems, if there are various characters. And should we allow that to happen? Now, we, of course, tend to, I think as a general rule, tend to think that, having kids act in a play, even having various types of gender fluidity occur and so on, boys playing girls, girls playing boys. It's no problem. It's just play. It's just play acting. They're playing a role in a play. It's no big deal. But Plato is very anxious about this, very concerned about this, because he assumes that imitation infects character. And it affects character. It has an effect on character, but it also infects character. It gets inside. It changes the structure and constitution of your character if you come to imitate a certain type of character. So Plato would definitely think that if you had made a career as an actor of playing villains, some actors specialize in villainous roles, right? Generally those with foreign accents from an American perspective, especially British accents. As we all know, British people are particularly evil or prone to evil, apparently according to Hollywood. And so those are the roles. Also German, people with German accents, very prone to evil. And so someone who had made a career in Hollywood as playing a villain, from Plato's perspective, would probably wind up as a villain, or would be, certainly if he had done it from a young age, there'd be a real danger that imitation would infect his character in this way. And there is a principled reason for this. Plato assumes that imitation is the way that one becomes adept at a craft. How does one learn to become, think about the various occupations we talked about. How does one learn to become a farmer or a carpenter or a blacksmith or a sailor? Well, at a young age, and remember we are just talking here about people at a young age, you imitate people who act in that way. And so there's a danger that someone who becomes, as he says, this is at 295C on page 278L, someone who becomes clever at doing illiberal or shameful actions might acquire a taste for the real thing from imitating it. Probably in Plato's defense here, he's not thinking of an adult who goes off to Hollywood and specializes in portraying villains, but rather of a young person who is learning these roles from a young age. There's a danger that this person... It's the same kind of worry, I think, are related to the worry that people sometimes have about young children playing violent video games, where essentially what they're doing is imitating, they're role-playing someone who is, let's say, a violent criminal or something like that. And so there's a concern that at a young age, getting used to imitating that will infect your character in that way. And so this really has nothing particular to do with the content yet, but it has to do with the form of the poem, like a poem that is focused on this kind of narration via imitation is going to necessarily require those who memorize it and who assimilate it into their soul, into their mind, but also into their soul from the Greek perspective. It's going to require them to, as it were, travel through these various personae. And that's potentially a problem because this will include various types of people that the guardian should be prohibited from imitating, such as cowardly or bad men, madmen, and even slaves. And he mentions also women. Although, as we'll see later, Plato also allows that women can be part of the guardian class, so there's a bit of a tension there. But presumably he means something like, women who are sort of stereotypically effeminate, who are passive, submissive, who aren't spirited, that kind of stereotype that has the kind of character that the guardians should avoid. It's only moderate and good men that our guardians should be allowed to imitate. So a mixed style then is the one that he ends up favoring as the appropriate style, but one that's predominantly narrative. So they need the narrative part, presumably because Plato's thinking they need to learn history, they need to learn sort of the cultural tales that sort of orient the Greek in the world, make them understand where they came from, who they are. So you need to have that kind of historical content, but it should be through straight narration, this kind of anonymous, neutral narration. And the imitation that occurs should only be with good men, behaving in good ways. So we can have a narrator talk about what the women and the slaves and the bad men and the madmen did in a kind of neutral, objective voice. And then when it comes time for the good men, the moderate and good men, as he says, to enter onto the stage, well, then they can imitate. Then they can imitate the particular persona of the hero and so on, because that's what they're supposed to become, and that's fine. That's not a problem. So that deals then with the style. And then this brings us to music in the narrower sense, which is, I think, very interesting to us, primarily for its foreignness in a lot of ways, the assumptions that Plato is making here about music. Now, these are going to be related because typically the classical poetry of the Greek culture would be set to some kind of music, would be portrayed with a musical accompaniment, although not always. And music is a kind of broader sphere, but typically poetry would be accompanied with music. So they go together in that sense. And this is why the first, he talks about the three parts of music, which are speech, harmony, and rhythm, but actually speech has already been dealt with up here. So under music in the narrow sense, we just deal with harmony and rhythm. Okay, Plato assumes that the form of the music that you're exposed to affects the shaping of your soul. The type of music affects the shaping of the soul as much as the words or content. And I think this is something, even though I described it as sort of foreign, it's not totally foreign. We understand why sometimes a parent might be nervous if their child, especially at a younger age, really gets into, some kind of punk or death metal or something that seems to be violent and destructive, potentially self-destructive, and so forth. And that they might not even be able to hear or discern what the music, what the lyrics are, what the words are that are being sung, if you call it singing. But just the form of the music itself is enough to cause a kind of discomfort. So we do have something of this idea that the form of music is potentially a problem. Since they are to be warriors, they should avoid soft modes, he says. So this is on page 280 in the right-hand column. He says, drunkenness is entirely inappropriate to our guardians, and softness and idleness as well. What then are the soft harmonies and the ones suitable for drinking parties? And this is the Ionian style, relaxed style, and also the Lydian style. But they shouldn't, of course, we can only speculate about. I'm not a scholar of musical history. Maybe there's some strong evidence of what exactly these were, but we can kind of guess. But of course, I think there remains some uncertainty. I could be wrong about that. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But we have modern versions of this. Elevator music. Soft adult contemporary music, that kind of thing. So they shouldn't listen to that stuff. It makes them soft, makes them relaxed. It's suitable for drinking. And so we don't want them to become drunkards, and so they shouldn't be allowed to have that. So what should he have? What should they have? He says, leave me that harmony that would appropriately imitate the vocal sounds and tones of a courageous person engaged in battle, or in other work that he is forced to do, and who, even when he falls and faces wounds or death or some other misfortune, always grapples with what chances to occur in a disciplined and resolute way. So that's one thing. They should have basically military music. Of course, we naturally think here of the various hymns and anthems of World War II, for example, that the Nazis, for example, like to march to. And so this makes us a little bit nervous, but it's understandable in Plato's perspective what he's getting at here, that they need to be able to have music that gets them pumped up for battle, eye of the tiger kind of stuff, so that they're ready to fight. But they also need another kind. He says, leave me another harmony when he is engaged in peaceful enterprises, or in those he is not forced to do but does willingly, or for when he is trying to persuade someone of something, or entreating a god through prayer, or a human being through instruction and advice. or for when he is doing the opposite, patiently listening to someone else who is entreating or instructing him or trying to change his mind through persuasion. Leave me the harmony that will imitate him when he does not behave arrogantly, when these things turn out as he intends, but on the contrary, he is temperate and moderate in all his enterprises, satisfied with their outcomes. And we're reminded here of the dual nature that the guardians are required to have. On the one hand, they need to be spirited, they need to be high-spirited and aggressive in war, but then they also need to be able to come home and relax and not want to be fighting in the street or fighting the citizens. And so they need a kind of relaxation music that doesn't make them soft or it makes them drunkards, but that creates a kind of calmer state of mind that is receptive to learning and so on. And what exactly that would be is sort of unclear. He mentions instruments, and so we can get a sense of the kind of instruments that should be used, the lyre and the cithara. So you think of the stringed harp music. This is music that has often been used in many religions in the West and probably in the East as well for sacred purposes. So he associates it with Apollonian music. And this is opposed to Dionysian music, to use a contrast that was made famous by Friedrich Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, between the Apollonian, which is sort of like the sacred music of Gregorian chant. You're probably familiar with Gregorian chant, something like that, that involves this kind of ethereal, higher, detached mental state that isn't, as it were, felt below the belt, but is felt above the shoulders. And then you have the one that is felt below the belt, the sort of rockabilly music, the Elvis, the pelvis kind of music, the Dionysian, the music that is associated with the flute, in particular, the piping of Marsyas, the satyr, as we might mention when Socrates is associated with Marsyas. So that's kind of the primary contrast, and we want our guardians to be more associated with this kind of Apollonian aesthetic. The more intellectual, the less visceral, the less sexual type of music. Rhythm is as important for Plato as harmony. Training in the right kind of rhythm leads to grace and fine speaking. So rhythm, we want this for the sake of grace and naivete, he mentions. If harmony is basically divided into war harmonies, what we think of as military music, martial music, and peace music, which is to have this kind of Apollonian character, kind of a ethereal, intellectual, harp-based, lyre-based, rather than flute or more sexual-based music. Then the rhythm is going to have to do with grace and naivete. And training in the right kind of rhythm leads to grace, graceful speech, graceful music, graceful bodily comportment, and graceful thinking. So it's the mind, the mouth, and the body are all affected by rhythm, which leads to grace. And even suggests that certain metrical feet lead to illiberality, arrogance, madness, and other vices. So he takes this quite seriously. The style of music you're exposed to will affect your speaking style, but especially through the rhythm. And it's even going to affect your mind generally. So on page 282, he says, let's see. So actually, let's go back to 281. There's a lot here. I'm going to have an extended quote at this point. So this is just at the bottom of the right-hand column of 281. Grace goes along with good rhythm and lack of grace with bad rhythm. Furthermore, good rhythm goes along with fine speaking and is similar to it, while a bad rhythm goes along with the opposite sort. And the same goes for harmony and disharmony. Since, as we said just now, rhythm and harmony must conform to speech and not vice versa. And what about the style of speaking and what is said? Don't they go along with the character of the speaker's soul? And don't all the rest go along with the style of speaking? Fine speech, then, as well as harmony, grace, and rhythm, go along with naivete. I don't mean the foolishness for which naivete is a euphemism, but the quality of the mind has when it is equipped with a truly good and fine character. And mustn't our young people try to achieve this on every occasion if they're going to do the job that is really theirs? Now, surely painting and all the crafts similar to this are full of them, as are embroidery, architecture, and likewise the manufacture of implements generally. And so furthermore is the nature of bodies, and that is other things that grow. For in all of these, there is a grace or lack of it. In architecture, in clothing, in bodies, and in all things that grow, there's grace or lack of grace. Grace or lack of grace. And these go with good rhythm and bad rhythm, or harmony and disharmony. So we need to supervise not merely the poets, but all of the crafts to make sure that our entire culture is just permeated by this grace. Our guardians should not be brought up with images of evil or ugly, grotesque things, but only with gracious things. So we have to look for those craftsmen who are naturally capable of pursuing what is fine and graceful in their work, and those are the ones we commission. And he summarizes the basic core idea of musical education here in this passage in the center of the right-hand column of 282 when he says, so he's talking about the reasons that musical training is most important. First, because rhythm and harmony permeate the innermost element of the soul, affect it more powerfully than anything else, and bring it grace. Such education makes one graceful if one is properly trained, and the opposite if one is not. Second, because anyone who has been properly trained will quickly notice if something has been omitted from a thing, or if that thing has not been well crafted or well grown. And so, since he feels discussed correctly, he will praise fine things, be pleased by them, take them into his soul, and through being nourished by them become fine and good. What is ugly or shameful, on the other hand, he will correctly condemn and hate while he is still young, before he is able to grasp the reason. And because he has been so trained, he will welcome the reason when it comes and recognize it easily because of its kinship with himself. So the point of this is to inculcate clearly not through rational account, not through the standard Socratic method, aiming at the definition or the principle of grace, but rather it's inculcated in a kind of almost unconscious way. One is trained and conditioned to recognize grace when one sees it and to reject the opposite of it, the ungraceful, the shameful, the grotesque, the harmful. Now, naivete and grace are notoriously hard to define. There's a famous clip, one of the many famous clips from Seinfeld, where Elaine goes into interview for a job, and she's replacing, I believe, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And the person who's potentially going to hire her talks about Jacqueline Onassis in a way that became almost cliche by that time, that she had so much grace. And then the joke is on what exactly is this grace? And it turns out that Elaine does not have grace. Maybe if I think of it, I'll link that clip. I'm sure it's on YouTube. But naivete and grace, these were also studied extensively by Friedrich Schiller at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and they became important concepts in Romanticism. But the idea was, it may be best approached through the idea of a modern contrast. So the modern contrast case would be the person who is sort of inwardly torn within himself and feels a kind of inner conflict. And, this has Christian roots to some extent because it involves the idea of of the conflict between, on the one hand, the high ideal of Christian moral perfection, and on the other hand, the sinfulness and depravity of the human being who has all of these nasty, sinful desires. And so that conflict creates a kind of tear within the soul. And so, by contrast, grace, and you hear the religious overtones that this later came to have when Christianity came along, but grace involves a kind of knitting together of these parts of the soul, resulting in a kind of effortless oneness with oneself, where inner character and outer actions are spontaneously harmonized, and both are perfect and beautiful, like the characters on a Greek vase. And so naivete, of course, we think of children as naive, but also think of like the child who's just honest, who just speaks the truth, often to the embarrassment of their parents, because they don't have this sense of needing to deceive people or tell white lies in order to spare people's feelings or sensitivities. They're just straightforward, honest. It's just from their ears to their mouth. They don't have an internal censor. That's this kind of idea that our guardians should be those kind of people. St. Paul talked about, the Christian ideal. Jesus talked about the Christian ideal of becoming like a child. That's the idea. Childhood is a kind of moral ideal. And St. Paul also talked about the need for the Christian to be ignorant of evil. We don't want to know anything about evil. You don't need to, spend time, as it were, going ghetto in order to be able to slumming, right? In order to be able to experience the underside, the underbelly of things. You should remain ignorant of all that. You don't need to experiment with that. And that becomes a persistent theme here, that the good person is best suited by remaining naive, and particularly remaining naive of evil, of having their mind, their soul conditioned in such a way that they can just act and behave spontaneously, and they'll do the right thing. They'll be fine. They don't need to think about it. They don't need to be tortured about it. And that's the idea of grace as well here. And music is what does this, the proper kind of music. So remember, there was this popular Greek idea that we looked at in the Phaedo, that the soul itself is a kind of harmony. We saw Socrates rejected that idea, but clearly Plato here is having Socrates say that there's something to this idea, that the harmony of music in a way helps to harmonize the soul. And the attunement of the soul can come from the attunement that the music contains, and that can affect the soul either for good or for ill. Okay, so probably enough about that. But notice that this is really the justification for the importance of this kind of musical education. Clearly, it's as important as the kind of the more intellectual education into the content, the proper moral content of poetry. This is going to affect the way you feel, the way you viscerally react to things. And we want that to be a graceful way, and a naive way, a natural way in the positive sense. So we get a kind of refinement of the soul from music, call it sensitivity. Socrates relates this to knowing each individual element of a thing, like recognizing each and every element or letter of a word. He talks about it's like learning to read. We become adequately proficient only when the few letters that there are do not escape us in any of the different words in which they are scattered about. And when we did not disregard them, either in a small word or a great one, as if they were not worth noticing, but tried hard to distinguish them wherever they occur, knowing that we would not be competent readers until we knew our letters. So it's an obscure point, I think. I mean, he seems to be suggesting that musical education teaches one to recognize patterns, to recognize the order and harmony in the universe. And there might be a kind of, there are various, of course, we've seen pre-Socratic theories that employ this kind of idea, including the Pythagoreans, that there's a kind of cosmic order, kind of cosmic harmony, and musical education teaches one to recognize this pattern. I was recently watching the film Midway on HBO, and it has Woody Harrelson playing the World War II Admiral Chester Nimitz. And before the Battle of Midway, he is taken into the bowels of the code-breaking section of the Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii as they're trying to anticipate the Japanese attack and break the codes so they can figure out when the attack is coming, where it's coming from, what its objective will be, and so forth. And so Nimitz tells the chief intelligence naval officer that he wants to see this operation, see what's going on here, and question the main codebreaker, who's this genius, eccentric genius, question the codebreaker himself. And he goes in there, and the whole basement floor is just filled with all these codebreakers. And Nimitz says to this intelligence officer, he says, "I didn't know we had so many codebreakers." And the officer says, "Well, we don't. These are tuba players or musicians." I think later on Nimitz says that he doesn't trust a bunch of tuba players, but the codebreakers were musicians. And this chief codebreaker had decided that let's recruit these musicians from the band on the ships that had been sunk in the Pearl Harbor attack. So obviously they didn't have any function on those ships anymore. So let's take the bands from the military bands, the ceremonial bands from these ships, and make them codebreakers. Why? Well, the idea was that their musical training would teach them to recognize patterns. So that's kind of a long-winded, concrete example, but it's fresh in my mind. It's a contemporary example from a movie, so I thought it might be helpful. That this isn't just an isolated, eccentric idea that Plato has, that the education in music is connected with the ability to recognize patterns. And as we'll see later, this ability to recognize patterns is kindred to the ability to recognize the universal forms of things. This is connected to moral education. Already Plato is hinting at this in the top left hand of 283, where he talks about images of letters reflected in water or mirrors. That's going to be the image of the relationship of the forms, the universal forms of things, to the particular things that partake of that form. Is that those particular things are like reflections in water or in mirrors of the universal forms. And so Socrates even says, "By the gods, I'm saying that neither we nor the guardians we claim to be educating will be musically trained until we know the different forms of temperance, courage, generosity, high-mindedness, and all their kindred, and their opposites too, which are carried around all over the place, and see them in the things which they are, both themselves and their images, and do not disregard them, either in small things or in great, but accept that the knowledge of both belongs to the same craft and discipline." So musical education is akin to the ability to be able to acquire concepts of things, which is recognizing the patterns of things and the similarities that exist in the visible universe in those patterns. So the musical education is doing a lot of different things here. I mean, the primary thing is this continuation of the moral education that the guardians must have, sensitizing them to what's beautiful and lovable, which are the fine habits. A virtuous person is a harmonious person, and a vicious person is a disharmonious person. Musical education teaches us to distinguish the one from the other. But more generally, it seems like musical education is a kind of preparation for being able to recognize patterns in things, which enables us to ultimately achieve what for Plato, as we'll see, is the kind of the pinnacle of wisdom, which is the insight into the forms. In connection with this also, he recoups a kind of theme from the Symposium, the idea of Platonic love, as it came to be known, that beauty and the right kind of love involve the insight into the person's character. The most beautiful sight, he says, this is 402D on page 283, is of a person with a beautiful character and a beautiful body that's in harmony with that character. This is, again, a kind of image of grace or naivete, as I was suggesting, a kind of harmony of the inner and outer, where the person's outer body is reflective, kind of a symbol, in a way, of the inner beauty of their soul. That's what musical education is also going to sensitize us to. The right kind of love is the love of order and beauty that's been moderated by education in music and poetry. Look at this famous Platonic love. is that in which sexual pleasure must not be involved. On 283 on the right. Sexual pleasure must not be involved in the platonic love between the lover and the boy. We should lay it down as a law in the city that we're founding, that a lover, if he can persuade his boyfriend to let him, may kiss him, be with him, and touch him as a father would a son for the sake of beautiful things, but in all other respects, his association with the one he cares about must never seem to go any further than this. Otherwise, he will be reproached as untrained in music, as lacking an appreciation for beautiful things. So the Greek institution of pederasty is abolished in the perfect city. There will be as it were, the educational dimension, potentially, of that relationship, but the love will remain platonic. Okay, and so finally then we have physical training. After we've covered the two dimensions of the musical aspect of education, we get to physical training. And here, I think it's more straightforward, although we might note here that the main purpose seems to be to prevent the need for a lot of doctoring. Plato seems to see this parallel between someone who needs a lot of doctoring and someone who needs a lot of lawsuits, or to go to court for a lot of things. In both cases, there's a kind of decadence involved. That if you were living your life right, you wouldn't need to go to the doctor a lot, and you wouldn't need to go to the court. So there's this parallel, which for us might seem kind of unusual, but there's a parallel between reliance on medicine and reliance on the legal system. So the guardians should avoid intoxication. Their diet, however, should not be like an athlete's, because Plato observes that athletes' diet makes them sleep too much, but more like a soldier's, who has to just, eat in an encampment that might have to be picked up at a moment's notice. So simple roasted meat over an open flame without any sauce. That's the kind of diet that they should have. Their diet is to be comparable to their musical education. It's a kind of simple, naive, natural diet. And then he makes this remark that I've already alluded to, that the test of a failed education system is when many doctors and lawyers are needed in a city. That's the sign of a failure to arrange one's body and soul in the right way in the first place. In regard to medicine, Plato's critical of the long-term treatments that the rich of his day often employed. Medicine should be for specific diseases that can be quickly cured in a basically healthy body. And it sounds harsh, but Plato, or Socrates at least, endorses the view of the legendary Asclepius, supposed founder of Greek medicine, that you shouldn't treat someone who can't live a normal life. If they're not able to be treated and then go on their way and be basically healthy, you shouldn't bother treating them just to keep them alive. No life support systems in this republic. In connection with these remarks about the need for the city, or of the city, for doctors and lawyers, Socrates broaches the question of who would be the best doctors and judges. And the key contrast that he sees is in the ideal background of each. So the doctors, it makes sense for a doctor to have experienced a lot of different diseases of the body, as long as their mind is kept basically sound. If they've experienced a lot of diseases, they can appreciate it better. They can appreciate the condition that their patient is in, and they know the right questions to ask in order to ascertain whether this was the disease that the patient had or not. But with the judges, with the legal system, it's exactly the opposite. They certainly should not have experience with a lot of crimes, for example, or a lot of injustice. They should be kept naive in that respect. And that has to do with the fact that the judge deals with solely with the health or sickness of the soul, correcting the sickness of a criminal's soul, for example. And so he can't experience that, because then his soul would have to be corrupted, and the very instrument he would have to use in order to correct the criminal would be ruined. But that's not the case with the medical doctor. The medical doctor deals with the body, but he deals with the body with his mind. So as long as his mind remains basically healthy, he can allow his body to endure various illnesses. Okay. So the guardians are, of course, going to need regular physical training and exercise, but exercise arouses the spirited part. And so it should be moderated, lest they become too savage. Think about, professional football players or athletes who get all fired up and aggressive. They can't do that too much. They've got to have something to balance out their life. Otherwise, they're going to get into trouble, as many sometimes do when they carry that aggression over into their private life and they get into bar fights and things like this. So you want some way for them to be able to moderate their spiritedness. And in 288, he says, have you never seen the mindset of those, this is the bottom of the left-hand column of 288. Have you never noticed the mindset of those who have a lifelong association with physical training but stay away from musical training? Or again, that those who do the opposite. What is the mindset? The mindset, he says, is savagery and toughness in the one case and softness and overcultivation in the other. So those who stay away from physical training and just engage in the music, they become refined, soft, overcultivated. But those who just indulge in physical training and lack the musical, they become savage and tough. So this is why you need both. These balance each other out. This is why he says the gods have given two crafts to human beings. Musical training for the philosophical element of the soul and physical training for the spirited element of the soul, and presumably also the body as well. So the education of the guardians now appears complete at around, let's say, 412b or so, although he'll pick it up again later on. But at this point, he shifts the issue from the education of the guardians to the question of who should be the rulers in the city. Who should be the rulers in the city? And remember, we got on this excursus on the education of the guardians because we had said that we're going to have warfare because of our need for luxuries. It sounds like an oxymoron, but because of the natural human desire for luxuries, we're going to have to engage in warfare or protection of our city from those who engage with us in order to take our land and property in order to get luxuries for themselves. So we're going to need guardians. So this warrior class, how are we going to keep them from tyrannizing us, becoming savage oppressors? That was the question, you'll recall, that got us off on this discussion of the education of the guardians. But now the question is, who should be the rulers? And it turns out that Plato has actually been doing double duty here, because what he's been suggesting implicitly, and a lot of what he's been getting at here, is that the guardians would be the best rulers of the city, because they're best at guarding the city, which is the function of the rulers. So the function of the guardians is to guard the city, and the function of the rulers is also to guard the city. So naturally the guardians will be rulers, but not all the guardians. The rulers are to be selected from among the guardians. They are to be the select of the guardians, those who are most eager to pursue what is advantageous to the city. So they're to be tested in various ways. He says the rulers must be the best among them. And that means that they've got to be, I'm looking at the lower right-hand column of 289, they have to be the best at guarding the city. And this isn't just a matter of being the best warrior. It's not just that, Achilles should be the ruler because he's the best warrior. What makes them best at guarding the city isn't just their ability as a warrior, but they're being knowledgeable and they're loving the city. So and here it's left kind of vague exactly how knowledgeable they must be, but this would be kind of relatively uncontroversial. The rulers of the city should be the most knowledgeable people, whatever that consists in at this point. So the most knowledgeable, the most knowledgeable among the guardians should be the rulers. And also those who love something, who love the city the most. Because if they love the city the most, they'll be most likely to be most motivated to protect it. And so this is going to mean wedding the fate of the rulers very closely to the fate of the city. As he says in the bottom of 289 right-hand column, someone loves something most if he thinks that the same things that are advantageous to it are also advantageous for himself. So we must choose among the guardians those who we observe are most inclined throughout their entire lives to do what is most advantageous to the city. We observe and we test them who are the ones who seem to be most civic-minded in that sense, who love the city the most and are most keen to always do what's advantageous to the city, who see their own fate as most closely tied to the fate of the city. And so how are we going to test them, whether they're that way? We test them to see whether any compulsions or what he calls magic spells, by which he seems to mean fears and pleasures, whether they can be got to abandon their love for the city and their dedication to it. We test them through temptations, in other words, trials and tribulations, to see whether we can get them to abandon this love of the city. And if they make it through all of these trials and tribulations, then they will be selected as what he calls complete guardians. The complete guardians. So the complete guardians are the rulers. Those that are left over, he calls auxiliaries. So the roles in the city are now set, and they're cemented by a noble lie. This is one of the famous accounts of the Republic. So I encourage you to read carefully on pages 291 and 292 at the end of book 3, where he goes through this. The basic idea is that there's to be this myth that's told to the guardians especially, but really to all of the residents of the city, a kind of myth of origin that says that you are all brothers because you all came out of the earth, out of the same place in the earth, and were formed by a god. But when this God was making you, he put gold into some of your souls, silver into some, and bronze into others. And this is the iron and bronze. And this is the myth of the metals. And so those who have gold in their souls are the ones who are suited to be guardians. Those who are silver are suited to be auxiliaries. And those who have iron and bronze are basically the rest of the people, the craftsmen and so forth. And so there's clearly a kind of a sort of racism, actually. I mean, quite literally, there's people are fundamentally born different, with different fundamental core essences that they had no responsibility for, and that determine what their possibilities and potentials are in life. But the purpose of this is to protect the city, for the good of the city, because in part of this myth is going to be to say that those who are guardians and auxiliaries shouldn't be allowed to touch gold and silver. And we're going to tell them that it's impious for them to touch gold and silver because they've already been given gold or silver in the case of the auxiliaries, but the rulers already have gold in their souls. They've been given by the gods. And if they go and chase after physical gold, that's essentially like showing disrespect to the gods and impugning the gift that you've been given and saying, I don't like the gold in my soul. I need some other better gold over here. So they're going to be afraid to do this. And this is going to, of course, the effect of this is going to be to prevent the guardians from exploiting the city, enriching themselves at the expense of the city and so forth. Okay. Finally, in connection with this, the guardians have to live in a Spartan military kind of style, the kind of monastic condition. And that's described in the final column of book 3 here. None of them are allowed to possess any private property. Just like monks, they're not allowed to have private property. And none should have living quarters or storerooms that are not open for all to enter at will. Same thing as in many monastic arrangements. This is an explicit part of the rule of Saint Benedict, for example, one of the most influential monastic rules followed by most monasteries traditionally in the Western area of Christendom was that one should always have one's room accessible and open. Originally, there was a kind of barracks arrangement in monasteries. They should have common messes to go to. So there's no sense of, it's a complete communism here. There's no private property. And so all of this is set up to ensure that the rulers won't set themselves up as kings and people who are accumulating wealth for themselves at the expense of the city. Okay, so this leads us to the conclusion and the second discussion question. Do you think that the measures that Socrates suggests for choosing the rulers of the city and the precautions he takes to ensure that the guardians would not become tyrants would succeed in their purpose? Why or why not? Do you think this kind of system would be better at achieving a well-governed and happy city than the democratic systems we favor today? Why or why not? So once again, the second discussion question. Do you think that the measures that Socrates suggests for choosing the rulers of the city and the precautions he takes to ensure that the guardians would not become tyrants would succeed in their purpose? Why or why not? Do you think this kind of system would be better at achieving a well-governed and happy city than the democratic systems we favor today? Why or why not?